a recording. We'll be sharing a recording of this presentation and any calls to action or resources we discussed during the webinar. If you have questions, please go ahead and use that chat box to pop them in there. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I think I'm ready to turn it over to my colleague, Jenna.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So my name is Jenna Dotson. I'm the staff scientist at West Virginia Rivers. And as Kathleen said, today we're going to be talking about PFAS and West Virginia drinking water supplies. So just a little bit of background information on PFAS. So PFAS is an acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And what it is a group of man-made chemicals. It's a rather large group. There's about 10 to 12,000 different types of PFAS. And what makes a PFAS is a carbon chain. So you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, there's a bunch of C's. Those are the carbons that are linked. And those fluorine atoms that are linked to the carbon. So that carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds, and that's what gives PFAS their other name as forever chemicals, because they don't break down in natural conditions. That carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds, and it doesn't break down in the environment. So PFAS have been around for a while. They've been used in consumer products and industrial manufacturing since the 1950s. For their nonstick, stain-resistant, and water-resistant properties. And examples of products with PFAS are nonstick cookware, so your Teflon frying pans, and carpet, it's in food packaging and firefighting foam, and that's just to name a few. So then how do PFAS enter our drinking water supplies? There's a variety of ways. I think this infographic does a really great job of kind of simplifying the various ways that it can enter our surface water and our groundwater. So those industrial manufacturing facilities, like I mentioned before, they can have direct discharges into our surface water. And so through that direct discharge, PFAS can enter our rivers and enter our streams. Wastewater also can contain PFAS. So humans, one of the ways we excrete PFAS from our bodies is in our urine, which gets into the wastewater, of course. And so effluent from wastewater, which goes into our surface water, is another way that PFAS are introduced into our rivers, into our streams. And then the sewage sludge, or also known as biosolids, is applied to land, agricultural land, as fertilizer. And so runoff from that application can also contain PFAS, which gets into our surface water. A couple other notable ways that PFAS can enter our drinking water supplies is through landfills, so through leachate. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, PFAS are used in a wide variety of consumer products, and when we throw those products away, eventually they're going to wind up in a landfill, and the leachate from landfills has PFAS in it as well. And then another really big one is firefighting foam. So firefighting foam is used in large quantities at military bases and at airports. And so the firefighting foam can contaminate the groundwater, and it can also run off into the surface water as well. So those are kind of the main 5 ways that PFAS can enter both surface water and groundwater. Another notable thing, like Kathleen mentioned, is that PFAS are toxic. So they're dangerous at very, very low levels. So I think that it's good to just get an idea of what very small quantities we're talking about that could have negative health effects. So last year, the EPA came out with some drinking water health advisories for a couple different PFAS, and they were on the levels of parts per trillion. So just to give you all an idea of what a part per trillion is, as you can see in the graphic on the right-hand side, 1 part per trillion is equivalent to 1 single drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And if you look here on the left-hand side, those health advisories, they aren't even 1 part per trillion, they're 0.02 parts per trillion for PFOS and 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA. So we're talking about very, very small quantities of these chemicals that can lead to adverse health effects in humans. So as we know, PFAS have adverse health effects on humans. So what are those health effects? This graphic kind of goes through a couple of the known health effects. And so I'll just point to a couple. There's weakened immune systems. There are adverse health effects on reproductive health effects. So you can have lower birth weight and a wide variety of cancers. So kidney cancer, liver cancer, testicular cancer, breast cancer, all of those have been linked to various PFAS. And then in West Virginia, what we know about PFAS in West Virginia's drinking water supplies. Well, in 2020, the West Virginia Legislature passed a resolution that required the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Health and Human Resources to test for PFAS in all of the public water systems across the state. So that study and the data associated with that study were published last year. So that's what's shown on the right-hand side. They conducted this study in partnership with USGS. And what they found was that of the 279 public water systems across the state, 130 had PFAS that were detected at levels that were above those health advisories that I just mentioned a couple slides back. And so a key distinction here, though, is that they tested the raw water or the source water. And so that's going to be the water that's pumped from our rivers, from our streams, from our groundwater before it enters the water treatment plant. So in a follow-up to this study, the state is currently testing the finished water, so the water that has been treated at the water treatment plant, to see what the levels of PFAS are in the finished water that would then be distributed to customers. But I think it's quite notable, the map here that you see on the left-hand side depicts the 130 water systems that had PFAS detected at levels above the health advisory. And you can see that there are localized areas of contamination in the Eastern Panhandle and along the Ohio River. However, there are also high levels of PFAS in the central part of the state, the southern part of the state. So this really is a statewide issue. And then zooming in a little bit, these maps show the specific water systems where PFAS were found at levels higher than the health advisories. And so on the left-hand side, the map shows the central part of the state. The right-hand side shows the Eastern Panhandle. And I believe that Heather is putting in the chat right now a link to one of our info packets where you can take a closer look at these maps and see what water utilities may be affected in your area. And so these are other set of maps where we zoom in a little bit to southern West Virginia on the left-hand side and the Ohio River Valley on the right-hand side. So I would encourage you to open up our info packet and take a closer look if that's something that you would like to do. And now I will pass it over to Angie.
Hi, folks. This is Angie Rosser, Executive Director of West Virginia Rivers Coalition, from my car, sitting outside the Capitol because we're working on a bill that we want to talk to you about. And actually, we have one of the lead drafters with us of the PFAS Protection Act, Delegate Hansen, because one of the most important things we can do right now is set some policy that helps us begin to come up with steps to deal with these pollutants and reduce them at their source. So Delegate Hansen, I think, just got on, came off from a floor session to join us. So could I turn it over to you to walk us through what the PFAS Protection Act does?
Sure, thanks, Angie. Can you hear me? I'll assume you can hear me. Okay, good. Well, thanks everybody for your interest in this issue. I think it's an important one. You saw that map that shows how widespread the issue is across the state of West Virginia. There's two bills. One is a Senate bill that was introduced today. That's Senate Bill 485, the PFAS Protection Act. And there will be a companion bill with a House bill number in the next day or two. And this bill really does three different things, but all focused on trying to hold polluters accountable so that the public water systems and the ratepayers aren't stuck bearing the cost of treatment for PFAS. So the first thing the bill does is it requires the DEP to develop action plans for those water systems where PFAS has been detected in the raw water, and as well as possible to identify the sources of that PFAS and what type of programs, regulatory or non-regulatory programs, can be used to reduce the source of pollution. The second thing that the bill does is it requires manufacturing operations and any other type of operation that uses PFAS or has recently used PFAS in the production process to self-report that to the DEP so that the DEP can require monitoring from those sites. And that monitoring will help the DEP identify whether or not that's an ongoing source that needs to be addressed. And then the third thing that the bill does is it anticipates that the federal EPA will sometime soon release human health criteria under the Clean Water Act. These are limits on certain PFAS chemicals in the rivers and streams. And the bill requires the DEP to propose those federal water quality criteria as state water quality criteria so that they're enforceable in the state of West Virginia. And that again could help us hold accountable those sources of PFAS pollution through permits and other mechanisms. So that's a broad overview of the act, and I'll be on for the entire call if I could answer any more questions about that.
Thanks,
Thank-
Evan, for running us through that. As Evan said, we have a Senate bill introduced today. That's Senate Bill 45. Maybe one of our staff people can put a link to that bill because you can see it has 8 sponsors, both Republicans and Democrats. So we have a bipartisan Senate bill. What you can do is definitely thank those sponsors for their support of the bill. And as Evan said, we're expecting a House bill to come out. And the process from here is that one of those bills needs to get out of its House of origin by the 45th day of the legislature. And that comes pretty quick. So you'll be hearing from West Virginia Rivers Coalition about the status of both of the bills and where they are in terms of committee and who to contact to help get those bills moving through committee and become law. Again, with the data, with what we know now, with the data that Jenna presented, it's imperative that the state begin to take steps to figure out what we do about this problem. And as Evan ran through those 3 things, those are the sensible, measured next steps for West Virginia to take, because not taking action is not serving the public and not protecting public health. So we're at a critical time during a very relatively short legislative session that ends March 11th to get this bill passed. And just want to publicly acknowledge all of Delegate Hansen's heavy lifting on getting a complicated issue and problem solving into this bill. So I think we want to stop now and make sure we get to some questions from the audience. It looks like some are coming through the chat. Kathleen, can you help us field those?
Sure. So we have some great questions here in the chat, and we still have some time left this afternoon. So if folks have questions come up, be sure you put those in our chat box. The first question we have here asks, why airports would use firefighting foam?
Okay, sorry, I think I was muted. Yeah, so Evan actually answered a little bit of that question. So airports do practice and train with firefighting foam, and also firefighting foam is used to extinguish fire fueled by flammable liquids that are often used in air traffic and things like that. So that's why airports use firefighting foam.
Thanks, Jenna. So our next question, I think this one will go to you as well, Jenna. It says, if PFAS poses risks at a fraction of parts per trillion, what limits above 0 might be deemed permissible?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. And I think a question that EPA is grappling with right now. So one of the pushbacks that the EPA got when they published those drinking water health advisories was that those two limits that I showed for PFAS and PFOA are currently below the detection limits of current technologies. However, the technologies are developing very rapidly. The EPA is putting a lot of effort into developing technologies that can detect PFAS down to those levels. But when they come out with their drinking water standard or the maximum contaminant level, there's supposed to be a draft one that's published a little bit later this spring. They take into consideration technology constraints and kind of the practicality of utilities meeting that maximum contaminant level. So that's a great question. And I think that we'll see the answer to that when the EPA publishes those standards a little bit later this year.
Thanks. So our next question here talks about that finished drinking water and if PFAS can be filtered out of that water.
Yes, PFAS can be filtered out of finished drinking water. So you can use reverse osmosis and also granular activated carbon are the two technologies that can be applied for in-home filtration, if that's something that people were interested in installing in their own home. I think that the issue is for larger scale application of these technologies is still pretty expensive. And again, I think a lot of research is going into how they can filter PFAS out on a much larger scale on these like larger water utility scales. But on a home scale, yes, you could use reverse osmosis and granular activated carbon filters to filter out the PFAS. Mm-hmm.
Okay, our next question here, I'm going to turn it over probably to Evan because it's a legislation question. And it says, how does this legislation compare to what other states are doing? And how are other states effectively curbing PFAS?
Well, I think several states have started moving on this issue some number of years ago, and I can't tell you exactly what every state has been doing, but I can say that there's a couple of categories of actions that states have taken. One is their efforts to ban the use of certain types of PFAS or ban certain products that contain PFAS. So that's a little bit of a different approach than what we're taking in the West Virginia bill. And then another approach that had been used in some of the previous legislation in other states was for those states to adopt thresholds under the Clean Water Act or Safe Drinking Water Act for use in that state, even before the federal EPA acted. And the approach we're taking here is, especially now that we know that the federal EPA is moving forward and has a plan to enact these thresholds, is to wait for them to act and then to try to move as quickly as possible to get those into our state rules.
Great. Evan, while I have you, I'm going to ask you another question about the legislation. And that is, would this legislation affect the planned mine fire research facility scheduled for the snowshoe area?
I have no idea. Sorry.
I can answer that question.
Okay.
So if they were using PFAS in their firefighting foam at that facility, then they would be required to report it with this legislation.
Thanks, Autumn. That was our program director, Autumn Crow, hopping in there. Thank you. Here's a great question about where PFAS can be found. Is PFAS commonly found in groundwater as well as flowing water? Jenna, I'm going to hand that one over to you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's also a great question. So yes, PFAS is found in groundwater, and I think the word here, is it commonly found in groundwater? I think it depends on what sources of contamination that you have in the area. So for example, the city of Martinsburg and Berkeley County, they had their groundwater contaminated from an air base in that area. And that was partially due to the karst geology in that area and partially due to that major source of contamination right in that area. So it depends as far as how common it is on what's going on in the surrounding area. But yes, PFAS is found in groundwater.
Thanks, Jenna. So another question for you, and I'm going to combine two questions here. They're both talking about PFAS and how they can bioaccumulate in the body so that our bodies hold on to the chemicals. So the two questions are there tests available within West Virginia to detect PFAS levels in bodies? And then a similar question to that is PFAS similar to DDT in terms of bioaccumulation and passing up the food chain, from fish to eagles to people to whomever is consuming those lower level parts of the food web?
Yes, so for bioaccumulation, there is evidence that PFAS bioaccumulates in fish and up to humans, although there's a lot of research that's going into that right now to understand those mechanisms a bit more. And then as far as tests available within West Virginia to detect PFAS levels in the body, that's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that the CDC did an exposure assessment study from that groundwater contamination that I just mentioned in the city of Martinsburg and Berkeley County. So if you wanted to look into that a little bit more, I believe that you can contact them and kind of like volunteer yourself if they were to do another exposure assessment. So that's one way to find out more information about that.
And Jenna, what I remember coming out of that study so far is that, the longer people lived in that area and drank that water, the more concentrated PFAS they found in the blood. So that speaks to the bioaccumulation and length of exposure factors.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Great. And I just posted a link to a CNN article that takes a top level view at a recent report on PFAS levels in fish and what those levels could mean for human health. And you can link to the original study in that article. Question here about West Virginia water utilities, and are any currently filtering out PFAS pollution?
I could take a crack at that. Yeah, some of them are. On purpose or not on purpose. In the Parkersburg area, the water utilities in that part of the state have been purposely filtering out PFAS as a result of a lawsuit against DuPont, where DuPont has had to pay, I believe, hundreds of millions of dollars for treatment for those communities that have been impacted by PFAS discharged from their manufacturing facility. So those have installed a certain type of treatment. I think they've installed granular activated carbon, but I'm not positive, in order to reduce the amount of PFAS. And then there are other utilities across the state that are already using granular activated carbon, or possibly also reverse osmosis, I'm not sure. So that would be effective against PFAS. But there are many that are not.
Thanks, Evan. Here's a question about Blackwater Falls State Park and whether it gets its water supply from Davis, which is one of the community water systems that we found had detectable PFAS. Does any?
Yes. And maybe Kathleen or someone can link to the detailed tables that we prepared of the 130 water systems that we did find that Davis does serve Blackwater Falls State Park. So there's a concern there for people coming to visit the state, or those of us who love the park.
Thanks, Angie.
Yeah,
So,
but what the table shows is the systems alphabetically and the community served and the population served. People want to take a look at areas of the state they're particularly interested in.
thanks, Angie. We just popped that in the chat again. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send everybody a recording as well as all the documents and links that we've talked about during this discussion. I think one more question here, and this expands a little bit beyond PFAS. Are there other endocrine disruptors of concern in West Virginia?
I can answer that just a little bit. I don't know the specifics on which endocrine disruptors are of concern in West Virginia, but I do know that the USGS has released some studies on endocrine disruptors found in surface water in the state. So if you wanted to look into that a little bit more, I would recommend starting there.
Thanks, Jenna. Question just came in here about groundwater and if well water is affected by PFAS.
So yes, well water can be affected by PFAS as well. And so I know that the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper, Brent Walls, has done some testing of wells in the Eastern Panhandle part of the state and detected PFAS in water that comes from wells. So yes, it can get into wells because the wells are getting they're sourcing their water from the groundwater. So if the groundwater is contaminated, then the well water will also be contaminated.
Okay, so I think that's gonna wrap up our Q&A. As we heard earlier from Evan, there's a number of bills being introduced, 2 bills being introduced, a House bill and a Senate bill. And West Virginia Rivers Coalition will be sharing action alerts on those bills and how you can get in touch with your senators and your delegates to ask them to take action. The best way for you to make sure you're getting those is to sign up for our water policy news. That's where we send the most up-to-date information and links to all of our action alerts. I know many of you are already signed up, but there is a new feature in those, which is text messages. So some of our longtime legislative advocates know we get very little notice when things are moving. And sometimes we literally need to reach you within hours or even minutes to get in touch with your decision makers. So signing up for those text messages is really important and is our most rapid response system. So I just popped in the chat the link to sign up for those action alerts and the rapid response text messages. And tomorrow morning, you're going to receive an action alert from us that has all of the actions you can take this week on water policy issues, including the PFAS Protection Act. Thank you all for joining
And
us.
Kathleen, what will we be talking about next Thursday, Lunch and Learn?
Next Thursday's Lunch and Learn is, good question to put me on the spot. Let's see here.
Next Thursday, we'll be talking about the Mountain Valley Pipeline and actions you can take to comment on permits that are currently under review with the U.S. Forest Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. So if you feel like you've done this before, you have, and that's why we're hosting it on Groundhog Day.
There you go. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.